Hi, my name is Kevin Geer. I'm the lead pastor at Canvas Church in Kalispell, Montana. I want to thank Pastor Bill Wilson for the opportunity to share our Canvas story. It's always fun to be able to tell a story about your church, especially a story where you really feel that God has been doing, and you know that God's been doing an amazing work here, and it's fun to be able to share that story, and I hope it encourages you. In 2012, God moved on my family. I was working as the Children's Ministries Director in the Northwest Ministry Network to move to Kalispell, Montana to a church that was called the Christian Center. It's a church with over 80 years of history. It was a church that had great pastors and a great heritage, and was an honor to become their pastor. We were a church on a typical weekend of two gatherings, one at 9 and 11. We had a large orchestra and choir. We were known in the community as a church with a great Christmas program. In fact, in 2011, they said 11,000 people came through the doors that Christmas season to watch the performance. And that really was our reputation, what we were known by in the community. As the leaders of the church, the board, and the pastors began to dream of where God wanted our church to go in this next chapter of the story of Christian Center, we knew that God wanted to do some new things, move us to a different direction, a place that we had never been before. And that's a scary place to be. It requires boldness to be able to go when you don't know really where God is leading you. In fact, I often thought about the Israelites when they were going to the Promised Land. And every time that cloud by day or fire by night would move, the Israelites would have to pack up and go, and not knowing where they were going. And one of the things I saw about the Israelites is they would often grumble and complain. In fact, you know what they would say? They'd want to go back to Egypt. So many times they would tell Moses, take us back to Egypt. And yet Egypt was a place where they were slaves. And it was a place where their children were thrown into the Nile River. I mean, who would want to go back to that place? But I was impressed by the fear of the unknown is greater than the fear of a known bad situation. And God often calls us to go to a place that we don't know, and faith is trusting Him as you go. And that's where Christian Center was. We were at a spot that God was saying, I had a new chapter I wanted to write. Will you be willing to go where I want to go? In obedience, we had to say yes. In the process, we began to make changes at our church. In fact, I remember laying off 9 people within the first 6 weeks of the church as we began to restructure our church to the plan where God wanted us to go. I also remember quoting Joshua 1:9 many times. Do not be afraid or discouraged. Well, I guess it starts with be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or discouraged, for I am with you wherever we go. In fact, our mission statement, we really didn't have one penciled out or printed anywhere. It was simply go where God is leading. Go where God is leading. And whatever that required, that's where we wanted to be. I would often say that to our church. We're going to go wherever God is leading. But sometimes the best way to move people forward is to realize that where they're at is not as good as they think it is. So we had to create tension to be able to move our church forward. And one of the ways I did that was I brought in 3 people that I knew. I had them come to Kalispell and had them secret shop our church. Nobody knew that they were coming. And 2 out of the 3 said that they would never, ever come back. That's encouraging. And the third one said they'd only come back because they met the children's pastor, and the children's pastor was nice to their kids, so they might try it one more time. To create the tension, I read those reports to the people in our church. That was not the best of Sundays, but be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid, and I was, or discouraged, for God is with you wherever you go. But you know, God is faithful in that. And as we created that tension that we were not known as a friendly church, that we were an insider church, that we were a church that were declining in numbers, we were a church that was declining in our budget. Our first budget meeting, we were looking at selling property to be able to continue to pay the bills. That tension created a desire in our heart not to trust in ourselves, but to trust in where God was leading. You know, one of the key moments of our early part of our story is when a board member only lady board member on our board, made a statement that significantly opened the eyes to the reality of where we're at. As we begin to make changes, and we began to make some changes in our church, from worship style to what was worn on the stage. I wore jeans, and no one had worn jeans on stage before. And I'll share in a minute why we did some of those things. But as we were wrestling over some of the changes in the church as a board, one of the wisest older board women said, "Men," she was the only board woman, so she could say men, don't tell me you don't like change. And here's the statement then she followed up with. Every time you go to the hospital, you want 21st century medicine. You just want 1960s church. Wow, I could have never have said that. But here was a woman who was strong and courageous. I was hiding behind her. But I'm thankful for that moment of that voice to challenge our church to go where God is going and trust Him to provide. And we began to do that. Here's some of the things that we began to do. We began to reallocate our budget to enhance our gatherings. We knew that people were not going to invite their friends if they were embarrassed of what was happening on the weekend. And so everything became about that 9 o'clock and that 11 o'clock gathering. 1 hour, 5 minutes. We put money toward that. We took money from our Christmas program and said we're not going to do the Christmas program anymore because we're going to leverage what we were doing there and use that same energy into our gatherings. So what we do every week became what we were all about. That's easy to say in that sentence. In fact, I even said that sentence and I don't feel the weight that I should be feeling saying it because I remember how big of an issue that was. When you take the one thing your church is known for and change it, it becomes a difficult journey. And not everybody was happy and not everybody stayed. But something we were committed to is that the mission of God was greater than any person's feelings or agenda. That our desire as a leadership of the church and many in the church to go into this new chapter, this promised land that God was moving us to, we wanted to be in His presence more than anything else. And for us to do that, we had to let go of things that we were really holding on to, that God had birthed in the heart at one point, but wanted to do something else. And so we had to make some changes. As we began to move forward, we began to, as I said, leverage our gatherings. We really did that in 3 ways. We leveraged our kids' ministries, that we put a lot of effort and people, hired a full-time children's pastor for that position to lead our kids' ministries. We wanted a fun and safe environment. In fact, what we said is we want kids to wake up every Sunday morning like it's Christmas morning, running in and waking up their parents going, "It's time to go to church. We can't miss church." We wanted heartfelt worship. We wanted a worship that was going to be a place where people could lift their hands and worship God and feel encouraged and know that they were in the presence of God. And we wanted relevant Bible teaching. We wanted the Bible to come alive. In fact, we wanted the people to leave wanting to read their Bible even more. I would sometimes even tell part of a story and then not end the Bible story and tell them, if you want to know how it ends, you go read it yourself. But make the Bible alive, not a book that was old and hard to understand, but a book that was alive because the author is alive and relevant to their heart and their situation. So we began to work on that. It required me to, because I was, again, my first pastorate, I would sit in front of a team and preach it before I'd even preach it on a weekend, and then that team would critique my preaching. So we could make it be what it needed to be. Again, the mission is greater than any person's feelings or agenda, and I guess that started with my own feelings or agenda. And so there were many times after the pre-preach, I would tell myself, be strong and courageous. Do not be discouraged. Do not be afraid, for the Lord God is with you wherever you go. And man, I wanted to be, and I wanted our church to be in the presence of God, whatever that required. As we began to change our gatherings, we also knew we wanted to be a multi-generational church. That was my heart. I grew up in eastern Montana at a small church, and I always appreciated the multi-generationalness of that church. And then when we moved my senior year to Shelton, Washington, where my dad was the pastor, it was a multi-generational church. And when I was looking at making a move, I thought of going and planting a church, but I wanted to go to a traditional church where we would be multi-generational from the very beginning. But I also realized that we had to define what multi-generational church is. so that people could understand it, put their mind around it. And God was moving our church to be multi-generational. But here's how we defined it. And that's part of our story, a significant part of our story, is that we were going to be a church that was going to gear to the young. Because we didn't want our church to have an expiration date. We didn't want our church to get old and then be done. We wanted to be a church that was always gearing to the young. And we wanted to be a church that's always leaning into the wisdom of the wise. The problem with that statement, when you define it that way, though, is everybody hears it from the age that they're at. And so older people would hear that as they're going to lean into my wisdom. And younger people are going to hear they're going to gear to me. Yet to go where God is wanting to lead you, it's always a proactive way of living. And so we wanted people to hear that sentence, to gear to the young and lean into the wisdom of the wise in a proactive way, which means older generation, it's your job to make sure our church is gearing to the young. And young generation, it's your job to be seeking out the older to listen to their wisdom because they've walked the path before you. And God honored that. I don't know why I'm surprised, but I'm always surprised when God moves, because he always moves bigger than you ever dreamed. In the last 5 years at Canvas Church, we've baptized over 1,000 people. And get this, the second largest demographic of people baptized is 65 plus. Blows my mind. I never would have thought that. But as we begin to gear to the young by lowering the lights during worship, by adding lights and haze, by painting the ceiling and the stage black, by wearing jeans, and that, as we begin to gear to the young, God began to move in our older generation. And families began to come to church. Often it would be a young couple that would come to church. And then eventually they'd be coming here for a few months, and then their parents would be coming with them. In fact, just last week, just to tell you that this is still going on, just last week we had a connection card. It's a card that all of us fill out at the beginning of the gathering to respond to the message. And on this card that I received, a lady gave her life to Jesus for the first time. And when I flipped over the card to see the lady's name, because she had marked, I give my life to Jesus, and she was a first-time guest, on the line that said, who brought me, it said, my granddaughter. Blew my mind. That a church that would boldly go where Jesus was calling us to go, and it was hard and it was tough, and you had to quote Joshua 1:9 a lot, that God would begin to move in every age. Now, Canvas Church has 7 gatherings every weekend, 1 in Cut Bank. We have 6 here in Kalispell. And God is moving in ways we could never imagine. We average now over 3,200 people on the weekend. And one of the statements that I love to hear when people come visiting is they'll say, you're so multi-generational. Well, what I know to be true is we're committed to letting go of things that stop us from going where God wants us to go. To be bold and trusting that God has a bigger plan and a better plan than even we would have, and to trust him. You know, when your hand is in a position like this, you can't receive. The story on Cut Bank, which really magnifies the story of Canvas, as we went from Christian Center to Canvas and reintroduced ourselves to our community and began to become part of the fabric of our community and where they're at. We went to the church in Cut Bank, and they were without a pastor, and they were looking for a pastor, and they asked if Canvas would come alongside them. And we came to them and said, we would help you reach your community for Jesus. It's a small town of about 4,000, about 3,000 people. We'd come alongside you if you would let go of everything. If you would dissolve your board, if you would turn your resources over to us, we will come alongside, and with your people, we will create an opportunity for people to experience God in a life-changing way. And that group of 30, 25 people opened their hand and said, we'll trust you. And more importantly, we're going to trust that God is moving us in this direction. 3 weeks ago, we baptized 9 people. The church has been open for 6 weeks. We baptized 9 brand new believers, and their church is averaging over 100 people in attendance. They've never had a church like that in Cut Bank. Because when you let go of your preferences and you trust God, your hand moves to a position to receive. It doesn't mean that everything you receive is good. It's always sad when people leave your church because they're more committed to a worship style than they are to seeing people get saved. It's hard. You take it personal, and I have to remember, be strong and courageous. Don't be discouraged. Don't be afraid. God is with you wherever you go. That's the Canvas story. Now we're seeing people get saved every weekend. 14 people just got saved last week. We have a baptism coming up here very soon, and we have almost 60 people that are going to be getting baptized in water. It will be for over 300 this year. And those numbers are great, but every number has a name, and every name has a story. And more importantly, every story matters to God. God called us to go and write a new chapter and leave a great chapter behind that we could never have written the new one if it hadn't been written before, because he knew many people needed to give their life to Jesus. So you know what I hope is heard through this short video is that following Jesus and being bold in going where he calls you to go, and that the mission of following Jesus is greater than any person's feelings or agenda, brings glory to God's name. I end with this thought. In the parable of the lost sheep, Jesus told that story to religious people. And he ended that story by saying a line that so moves my heart, and it's that there's more joy in heaven over the one that is found than the 99 who stayed righteous. And my prayer for Canvas Church and my prayer for your churches is that you will lead boldly, and that you will have a passion for the lost, and that you will bring as much joy to heaven as you possibly can, going after the lost and watching God take you to a place that you never dreamed was possible. Thank you for listening, and have an awesome rest of the gathering.